Care Council together. And if this is interesting, if this topic is interesting or anything related to creation care is interesting to you, if you're part of APU's community, we would love to have you join. You can contact me if you'd like. So the title of my talk kind of talks a little bit about the order of the topics I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk a little bit about microorganisms, they're little, and then connect microorganisms to some of the challenges we have with plastics in the environment, and then connect microorganisms a little bit to climate change. And this is just kind of an overview. This is not exhaustive of all the ways that microorganisms, plastic, and climate change kind of intersect, but it gives you a little sampling. I also wanted to start by reading part of Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. And this verse adds to what we commonly talk about. We talk about the creation, that God is creator. We know that everything that exists is through God's creation. We know that God sustains life, and we talk about that sometimes. But this particular scripture passage talks about the Lord's ownership of the earth, that it belongs to him, that everything in it belongs to him. And this is the part that I think is hard for us to live out in practical ways, or it's easy to forget, or easy to have this truth kind of permeate our attitudes, beliefs, and our actions. So I'm just going to ask you to keep that in the forefront if you can, and I'll try to bring it back up throughout this talk. So if you were wondering what microorganisms are, they're living things that are small, and just by definition, they're the things you can't see with your naked eye. And what we're looking at here is from any kind of biology textbook, the Tree of Life, which shows a smattering of the diverse living things on planet Earth that are part of God's creation. And what this is illustrating is just kind of the relationships, or how related things are to each other. And they're spread out. But I want to point out a couple things. One, that microorganisms, or I sometimes call them microbes, that's just shorthand, are actually most of the things on this Tree of Life. Most everything that you see on this is microbial, and that really means that you can't see it with the naked eye. So most of life is not visible to our eyes. Now, what things are macroscopic? What are the things that you can see with your eyes? Those are the plants, the animals, I have them in red here, and some fungi. But everybody else, the bacteria here in blue, the archaea here in pink, the fungi, the algae, and other protists, they're all microscopic. And then we can add viruses on here. They're not even included on the Tree of Life because they're not technically alive, but we study them in microbiology. And I like to say we are living a microbiological reality right now with COVID-19 that is caused by a microorganism. Sometimes when I start my microbiology class in the very beginning of the semester, I use the theme of small things can have large effects. And we can see that even today, right, with you and I are not in the same space because of these little tiny viruses that are affecting our daily life. Now that's an example of some, maybe negative relationships that we might have with microorganisms, but there are a lot of positives out there as well. And one thing about this particular Tree of Life that doesn't come across is that even though there are all these separate living things out there, there's so much interdependency. There's so much interdependency of living things. It's really hard to show it on a figure, but that's not depicted here. And that's one of the things that actually I love about biology, and I love about microbiology, is how interconnected and interdependent so much of life is. I wanted to give an example of just an interdependent relationship. Coral, the animal coral, is part animal, but it's actually not just animal. It's what we would call a mutualistic symbiosis. Coral is actually a mixture of animal and microorganism. And the microbes that live within coral cells are in this little category over here of alveolates. They are photosynthetic. Sometimes we call them dinoflagellates, but they actually live inside of coral. And they're partially responsible for the color of coral because those little photosynthetic microbes that live inside of the animal cells have pigments. And so they're essentially making food for the coral to eat. Now when you look at this reef, you can see then there's all kinds of other life around the coral, and there are a lot of fishes, and approximately 25% of marine life lives in regions of coral reefs. So they're really important from an ecological perspective. So that's just a smattering, and then we could spend so much time talking about how all of these living things are interconnected and interdependent. I do want to remind you and myself that we too are dependent on some of these microorganisms. The oxygen we're breathing is coming, 50% of it is coming from microorganisms, the other 50% is coming from plants. So our very life on Earth here is sustained in part by some of these other creatures. All right, I'm going to shift to plastic, and then I'm going to connect microorganisms to plastic. I know you know what plastic is. It's a material, we like it because it's cheap, it's lightweight, it's durable, and it has revolutionized some aspects of our lives. For one, it's made transportation less expensive. It takes less fuel to move a plane through the air if most of the parts are made of plastic rather than metal, or a car. And it's also revolutionized medicine. It's enabled us to more easily sterilize syringes, for instance, or IV bags, and they're not made of glass anymore, so they don't break as easily. And so there's so many aspects of our medical lives that have been influenced by plastic. So plastics, have a lot of good things going for them, and they have really been used mostly since about 1950s, and then every year the amount of plastics used has increased, and we're looking at a trajectory where we're increasing our plastic usage as well. Now, if we're talking about from 1950 to this figure just goes up to 2015, we've made a lot of plastic. And so what we're looking at up here in the upper left blue arrow is pretty much all the plastic that's been made. What is it, 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic. It's kind of beyond comprehension here. Some of that is in use, but notice that more than half of it has been discarded. So that is thrown away. And so we're going to try to think about, like, what does that mean? What is away? Where is that plastic? Some of it has been incinerated, which means it's been burned. And that's kind of how you really get rid of plastic. I'm going to come back to that. And then finally, we have about 600 million metric tons that have been recycled. Now I want to point something out. That the amount of plastic that's been recycled since 1950 is about 7.2% overall of the plastic. So when we think, a lot of times when we're thinking about using plastics wisely, we think about recycling, but the reality is that we're not actually recycling that much. And we have some issues in our country with markets for some of the plastic that we collect to be recycled too, and that's another story. I also want to point out on this primary production side that in 2015, I took this figure from a paper, and that same paper, they report that in 2015, 42% of the plastic that was made that year was used in packaging. And packaging, generally speaking, gets discarded right away. So it kind of goes, it's made, and then there's, a product, and you open the packaging, and then it immediately is thrown away. So we're talking about a very short amount of time that plastic even stays in circulation. So that's a lot. And as we're thinking about the issues of plastic, one thing we should be thinking about is, if we decide we want to decrease our plastic usage, what areas would be ripe maybe for lowering? What things do we need plastics for, or want plastics for, and what things do we not need them for and not want them for? I want to point out too that maybe it'll be obvious in the next few slides, but the way that we can get rid of plastics for good is essentially burning them and incinerating them. That's really the only way to remove them from the environment. But I also want to point out that that gives off CO2. So you basically break down all the carbon in the plastic until it's CO2. And so that's going to have some implications for greenhouse gas accumulation, emissions. All right, when I say plastic is really not just one thing. And you may know this, plastics come in different types. And if you've ever looked at recycling numbers on plastic items, Numbers 1 through 6 correspond to specific plastics. And then number 7 is just kind of a catch-all. Everything else made of plastic that's not, you know, the type of plastic 1 through 6 gets a 7 stamp on it. And those are hard to recycle because they're usually mixed plastics. Here you can see an example is melamine, which is often used in plastic plates and cups, the ones that you don't throw away, the ones that you keep longer. But also I want to point out that synthetic fibers that we wear, a lot of our clothing is made from polyester and acrylic. Those are really plastics, and those are in kind of the number 7 category as well. So we've got plastic in a lot of places that we're aware of, and then sometimes in places we're not really aware. But as going back to the point that plastics are different types, plastics are human-made materials. They're synthetic, and they're made up of repeated units of smaller molecules. We call those molecules monomers. So for example, if we look at PVC, which is number 3 plastic here, its kind of building block looks like so, and then the long plastic is just repeated units of that monomer. And then if we look at number 1 plastic, PET plastic, it has a different chemical structure. The monomer that makes it up has a different chemical structure, but it has repeated units as well. So they're all the same in that they're all made up, they're really large molecules that are made up of repeated monomers, but those monomers are different depending on the type of plastic. Most plastics are made from fossil fuels, and there have been estimates that about somewhere between 5 and 6% of all oil production goes into plastics. The next point is important because there is very little natural biodegradation of plastics, and therefore the plastic can accumulate in the environment. And so that's one of the things I'm going to be connecting now to microorganisms. First of all, what is biodegradation? Plastics don't biodegrade, but what is biodegradation? It's really the decomposition of organic or carbon-based matter, and it's done by living things, and they're often microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. And you've seen this in action before. Here's some fungi growing on a downed log, biodegrading it. If you have a compost pile, or if you've seen a compost pile, those kitchen scraps and landscape waste are being biodegraded by microorganisms. And then you may not be aware of this, but this is a sewage treatment plant. Our solid waste that is collected at sewage treatment plants also is gets decomposed by microorganisms as well. So we do actually have a lot of, if microorganisms weren't biodegrading, we would be walking around neck high in dead things, really. Now, plastic undergoes very little natural biodegradation, and really that's because microorganisms don't have digestive enzymes to break plastic down. They just can't digest it. These are very, very large molecules. They need to be able to digest it into smaller pieces before they can use it to, make more of themselves, or, use it to convert energy, etc. So they're lacking digestive enzymes. It's really the same reason why you and I can't eat plastic and get any sustenance from it. We don't have the enzymes that would break it down. The other point is that each of those different plastics, if there were microorganisms that could, that had digestive enzymes, each kind of plastic still would require different enzymes, different unique enzymes, because they're different structurally, they're different chemically. Now, there have been some bacteria, probably a few fungi as well, that have been found that seem to do some plastic biodegradation. It's rare, but people are looking for them, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But because microorganisms don't have these digestive enzymes and don't do very much plastic biodegradation, it accumulates in the environment, it doesn't go away. Like a tree falls in the woods and eventually it's going to go away, but plastic doesn't. So where does it accumulate? Well, in landfills. So we put some of the plastic in landfills. And then some of it is not captured in landfills, so it gets into the land and in fresh waterways. When it rains or the wind blows, it usually gets into waterways. And then those waterways lead into marine environments. And then there's some plastic that is of marine origin, like fishing nets and things like that as well. So the plastic accumulates, but it's able to get into some places we don't necessarily want it to get to, and then it doesn't break down very easily. And I should say, it's not that plastic doesn't break down into smaller pieces, because it can. It can break down from wave action, or some sunlight energy can help break it down to smaller pieces. And that has its own challenges, because you may have heard of microplastics. Those get even harder to take out of environments. It's not that plastic doesn't break down into smaller pieces, but it's never actually completely broken down into carbon dioxide, really. Here we're looking at the North Pacific Gyre, which you may have heard of before as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's the natural region in the ocean where currents kind of swirl, and a lot of plastic accumulates in this gyre. And actually, the largest garbage patch, I guess we could say, in a gyre is in the Pacific, but all oceans have gyres, and all of them, you can find plastic in those gyres. Now, I have California circled here because we are an input then. Some of the plastic that gets washed into the ocean from our shores can wind up in this kind of garbage patch here. And I think we know it's been traced back to you know, our region specifically. How much plastic is produced per year? Well, every year, anywhere between like 600 and 620 billion pounds approximately gets produced. Again, these are huge numbers. It's really hard to fathom what we're talking about here. But if we split it by people, by human being on planet Earth, it'd be about 83 pounds per person. And it's probably more for Americans. That would be my guess. That number, though, is expected to quadruple by 2050. Now, how much of the plastic that we produce then ends up in the ocean? A study in 2010, was done in 2010, published in 2015, estimated somewhere between 8.8 and 26 billion pounds. Again, really hard to imagine what that means. So one of the authors of this study, in testifying to Congress, kind of painted an easier picture maybe that we could imagine. She said that that is equivalent to 5 grocery-sized bags filled with plastic going into the ocean along every foot of coastline in the world. That's how much plastic is winding up in the ocean every year. That amount from a 2015 paper was expected to increase anywhere between 2 to 10-fold in the next, by 2025, meaning the amount of plastic going into the ocean. So we've got all this plastic winding up in the ocean. It goes beyond the geographical boundaries of our countries, and then it's there, and it's going to be a challenge to remove. But what else is happening? Well, the plastic is definitely affecting marine organisms. And we could spend a little time talking about this, but I'm really going to just mention 2 organisms, how they're affected by plastic in the ocean. Birds, and specifically seabirds, are eating this plastic. Now, this is a photograph taken by Chris Jordan, who did a series of photographs on Midway Island in the Pacific. And nobody lives on Midway Island except for National Park Service workers, but they get all kinds of plastic debris that's brought by the gyre, the Pacific Gyre, and then it winds up on the shore. And Midway Island is a really important breeding ground for a lot of seabirds. So here, what Chris Jordan is taking a picture of is a bird that died. And notice that most of its body is biodegrading, decomposing, but within its intestines, there was a lot of plastic debris. Now, plastic debris can obstruct intestines, but it also limits the amount of food that birds can eat. And that's a big deal for seabirds because they spend a lot of their life flying, and flying requires an enormous amount of energy. So they need to eat a lot. So it does affect them, but it affects, it affects the amount of birds, the amount of offspring that they can produce too. There are a number of effects. Besides looking at this bird, you can see like there's something that we recoil at, I think, and seeing the kind of plastic that's filling one of God's creatures' intestines. This figure is just showing the reporting in the literature where people are finding plastic in the intestines of various seabirds. And this was just a study looking in the literature, but by 2010, there were over 80 or almost 80 different birds had been reported to, bird species had been reported as having plastics in their intestines. By 2050, the projection is that about 99% of seabird species will have ingested plastic, and that's over 300 species. And we're concerned about that because, you know, while plastic is maybe not the biggest threat to seabirds, dwindling fish populations is also a big problem for them. But this is just one more challenge for them to live their lives. Now, why do birds eat plastic? It was assumed for a long time that birds were using their vision in eating things, and it's like, well, these plastic things maybe look like fish or jellyfish. But it turns out that with plastics in the ocean, a lot of microorganisms can attach to plastics, including algae. So marine algae, they're microorganisms. And they've been shown to be able to attach to specific plastics, polypropylene, polyethylene. And okay, they get a free ride, but what ends up happening is that those algae give off a chemical attractant called DMS. And it turns out that some seabirds, they don't eat with their eyes, they eat with their nose. They're smelling this chemical, and that tells them it's food. DMS is something that krill, their normal food source, or one of their normal food sources, gives off. And so it's sort of, in a way, microorganisms giving off these chemicals are sort of, in a way, tricking the bird into thinking it's food. One more thing, plastics can also affect coral health. There was a study that came out a few years ago to this effect, reporting on this. But first, I just wanted to point out, I mean, plastics, again, are not the biggest problem that coral are facing, because rising temperatures, rising global temperatures and acidification of the oceans are already threatening coral health. And you may remember, because this was international news, in 2016 and 17, 50% of the Great Barrier Reef was lost. What you're seeing here is coral bleaching. So the coral turns white. That's what we call coral bleaching. That usually happens with high temperatures. If you remember before, I was telling you that coral is actually an animal and a microorganism living together symbiotically. When coral bleaches, because of high temperature, those microbes that are providing food for the corals either die or they actually just leave the coral cells. And so bleaching is evidence that those little microbial symbionts that normally live and make food for corals have left, and they can't survive there anymore. And so once the coral bleaches, it doesn't have very long to live because it really, really relies on those symbionts. That's an aside. Coming back to plastic though, plastic debris is also correlated to coral disease. There was an increased chance, about 20 times increased chance, that if coral was in an environment with a lot of plastic debris, that it would become diseased. And usually disease, in this case, was being caused by microorganisms that were causing disease in the coral, different ones. But why would this be the case? And it's probably because there's mechanical damage. So if you have large pieces of plastic that are moving through wave action and then they bump into the coral, it causes damage to the coral tissue, and that leaves an opening for microorganisms to get in and cause an infection. Also, the thought is that there's probably microorganisms also attached to those plastics that then immediately get into the coral and can cause disease. So again, plastic is not the largest threat to coral health, but it is a factor. It seems to be a factor. And unfortunately, the projections are not good for coral. They have a lot of activities are making it difficult for them to survive on this planet. It's thought that coral reefs may become the very first major ecosystem to go extinct. Now, again, remember that coral reefs support about 25% of marine life, and they do other wonderful things like protect shores from storm and flooding, and people who live on coastlines maybe fish for their sustenance or for their livelihood in these coral reefs. So we're talking about a really serious problem. Things are getting kind of bleak here, so I just want to encourage you to draw upon your courage and maybe on those theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And let's walk through this with some courage and hopefully with some love, faith, and hope, that because this is going to get a little bit dark. But I will try to help us think about some ways we might be able to, I don't know, help stop some of the damage that we're doing environmentally. We're going to come back to that idea, hopefully. All right, so just as a summary then, how are plastics and microorganisms connected? Well, microorganisms, importantly, are unable to biodegrade plastic. Now, the implications here are then going forward, should we be switching to biodegradable plastics? If we're not going to just completely get rid of plastics altogether, should we be switching to biodegradable plastics? Those are ones that can be broken down by microorganisms. And there are some plastic-like molecules that bacteria have been shown to make. And so that's been one proposal, is what if we think about the materials we're using and make sure that they're biodegradable? That's going forward. But how are we going to be able to deal with the plastic that's already been discarded? As I mentioned before, there are people looking for microorganisms that can biodegrade plastic, but is it practical to be introducing them into every environment where there's plastic accumulation? That might not be practical. And we also have to remember that the plastic, whether we incinerate it actually, or we let microorganisms biodegrade it, it's going to turn that plastic into CO2. So that will, increase greenhouse gases. So we've got some real challenges here. And then, as I mentioned before, microorganisms can attach to marine plastics. For birds, seabirds, that seems to encourage them to eat more plastic. And then that can do some damage to corals when plastic bumps into them, and they're more easily infected by microorganisms. So I'm going to switch now, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about plastics and climate change. Oh, oops, no, I'm not yet. Sorry, I forgot about this. Going forward, so I haven't presented you with very many solutions here. But one of the things that we absolutely need to do is slow down environmental plastic inputs. We have to do that. So we can't just keep letting the plastics go where they're going. And we probably just need overall to be using much less plastic, even though that's not the prediction. The prediction is we're going to be using more. On a personal level, we can do things like refuse plastic. No, I'm not going to buy that thing because it's in plastic wrap. I don't need that plastic bag, etc. We can, of course, reduce our plastic usage. We can reuse plastic. The things that we have that are plastic, we reuse. Our clothes that are made of polyester and acrylic, we wear them until they wear out, for instance. And then I have recycling plastic here in really small letters because maybe there are a lot of problems with recycling plastic. One of them is that a lot of times we don't clean the plastics before we put them in the recycling bin. And in 2018, China decided that they didn't want to be taking our plastic material anymore, any of our recyclables. We were sending most of our recyclables to China. One of the reasons they didn't want it was because we were sending it dirty. And so it wasn't clean enough for them to do very much with. So that's one thing. And then the other point is that since 2018, we've had to figure out what are we going to do with the plastic that we collect, because recycling means you're going to repurpose it. And so to repurpose something means somebody wants that repurposed item. There have to be markets for buying those recycled plastics, or buying the plastics that we're trying to recycle, and then the things that we're making out of that plastic, there needs to be a market where people need to want those things. So one of the things we can do too is look for items. If we're going to buy something made out of plastic, look for items that are made from recycled plastic. There are a number of things: tents, backpacks, fleeces, those like lawn furniture, things like that that are made from recycled plastic. So we could start looking for that. If that's something that, especially if we're people who kind of our default is, hey, here, let me take care of creation, let me recycle plastic. Well, I'm just going to challenge you, then think about using things that are made from recycled plastic. So there is some kind of a market. A little update. Well, we've had a number of conversations in California about plastic and about what we think are good uses of plastic and what things are not good uses. So we've had the bill to ban single-use plastic bags from grocery stores and plastic straws at restaurants without being asked. So we're having some of those conversations. Well, there was a bill that was introduced last year in the California Assembly that was really the most comprehensive plastic bill that we had seen. It was called the California Circular Economy and Plastic Pollution Reduction Act. And it looked like maybe with some revisions it would pass, but an update, it just died September 1st of this year. So that's not an option at the moment, but all of this to remind you that we in California have been looking to political solutions as well to try to deal with the amount of plastic. So there's what you can do on the personal level, but also what can you do on kind of a larger level, and using political institutions to, to come up with policies is one way that we might as a group start to limit the plastic that is getting out into the world. Okay, so now I'm switching topics. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about microorganisms and then connect them a little bit to climate change. I just want to remind you, and this is a biologist talking, so I'm going to keep it simple because that's how I understand it anyways, that our Earth is surrounded by an atmosphere and that the sun is radiating down on the Earth. But we have something in this atmosphere called the greenhouse effect, where gases in the atmosphere are trapping and returning some heat radiating from the Earth. And this is keeping the Earth warm enough really to sustain life. It's a natural process, it's a necessary process. It's why life looks the way it does, or it's part of why life looks the way it does on planet Earth. It's part of the natural, what can I say, natural, I don't know, just heating element on planet Earth. So that's normal. However, you know probably that our greenhouse gas emissions have been going up. Basically since 1885, since the Industrial Revolution, they've really gone up. And this is through human activities. So this is looking at, from 1960 to about 2015, this is looking at carbon dioxide as a main greenhouse gas that is accumulating in this environment, causing more heat to be trapped from the sun. And you can see as the CO2, which is the blue line here, increases, so is the overall average global temperature increasing in red. So carbon dioxide is one of the main greenhouse gases that's driving worldwide warming. It's the main one. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about another greenhouse gas, methane, though, and that is more connected to microorganisms and their lifestyles. I'll say that. All right, so if we look, this is from the EPA, this is in the United States, this is the overall greenhouse gas emission by percentage. So you can see in the United States, carbon dioxide is the major greenhouse gas that we emit. Then there's methane, nitrous oxide, and then we have fluorinated gases here. Now what's interesting, just microorganisms are involved in some of the balancing of greenhouse gases on Earth. Not all of it, but some of it. They play a role in balancing some of these greenhouse gases. So microorganisms can produce greenhouse gases like methane, CH4, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. Most of the methane is produced strictly by microorganisms, but carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide is produced in other ways that are more directly connected to human activities. Agriculture, transportation, burning fossil fuels and things like that. But microorganisms can also reduce greenhouse gases. They can lower, especially CO2 levels. Two ways that they do this is one through photosynthesis. We might call it carbon fixing or carbon dioxide fixing. About 50% of the living things that do photosynthesis on planet Earth are microorganisms. So they're helping to lower the CO2 through photosynthesis. By the way, the byproduct they give off in photosynthesis is oxygen that we're breathing. So 50% of the oxygen we're breathing really came from microorganisms. And then another way that microorganisms can reduce greenhouse gases is by making calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate you can find in the kind of outer cell walls of some kinds of algae, single-celled algae here. These are actually photosynthetic algae as well. And when they die and they get laid down in sediments, they form limestone. So this is looking at the cliffs of Dover in England. This is limestone, but this limestone actually consists of little microorganisms. So they are fixing some carbon dioxide, building it into calcium carbonate, and then that sort of is we would call that a sink of carbon dioxide. Again, microorganisms are not the only organisms that make calcium carbonate. So do corals, so do shelled mollusks, oysters, and things like that too. But that also helps decrease CO2 overall and reduce greenhouse gases. So let's go back to methane. Methane is sometimes called natural gas, CH4. And even though methane is about 10% of the US emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, it does have a little bit more of a warming potential than carbon dioxide. And so it can warm 28 times that of carbon dioxide over 100 years, but in a shorter amount of time, 20 years, over a 20-year period, it can warm 86 times more than carbon dioxide. So even though it's a smaller percentage of the greenhouse gas emissions, it is not insignificant. And I'm talking about methane because this is one of those greenhouse gases that we don't necessarily talk about too much, but it's really, really connected to microorganisms and their lifestyles. Methane is a production, or methane production is a byproduct of microbial biodegradation of organic materials. Certain microorganisms in oxygen-free environments, and these microorganisms are called methanogens. They're kind of like bacteria, but not exactly. They produce methane. So they only produce them in environments without oxygen. They look like this if you're going to look at a scanning electron microscope picture of them. They're really small. Single-celled, but they can produce methane in landfills. So if you look at this is US methane emissions by source. We have landfills here. We're going to find them in landfills. We're going to find them in animal gastrointestinal tracts. That's this enteric fermentation. And then also in wetlands and waterlogged soil. That's probably where the most methane is produced worldwide. That one you're not seeing on this pie chart. Maybe that's other. But worldwide, more methane is probably produced from wetlands than any other source. Now 55 to 60% of the methane that's released by these microbes is actually coming from human activity. And I know that sounds weird because it's microorganisms that are making methane, but they are making more methane because of some of our practices. So I'm going to explain that a little bit more. So to give you one example, in landfills, landfills are, you put your trash in the landfill and then you cover it up and it becomes an environment without oxygen. We could call that an anaerobic environment. And depending on what you put in your landfill, remember methane is made when these methanogens degrade organic materials. So if you're putting in a lot of organic materials into the landfill and then it gets covered up, more of those organic materials are going to be biodegraded by methanogens, producing more methane. So in California, about a third of our waste that goes into the landfills could actually be composted rather than put in the landfill. And if it were composted, we would have much, much less methane emissions. Composting your organic waste, and that includes things like food, landscape waste, but also things like paper and cotton. If you compost it, when you're composting, there's some oxygen involved, that decreases, it diverts basically those materials from going into a landfill, which would be covered up and become oxygen free, and then more methane would be produced as a result. So by composting, you could do this as an individual, you could compost, your organic waste, that would decrease methane emissions overall. California has passed a series of laws over the past, I would say, like year and a half, that are mandating a lot of diversion of organic waste from landfills. We're recognizing in this state that we have got to cut down on the amount of organic waste that's going into the landfill. So they're going to be, I think, businesses have to do this, but a lot of municipalities are going to be probably giving a green bin to people to put in their organic waste so that it doesn't go into the landfill. Then we have our methane produced in gastrointestinal tracts. And enteric fermentation is what we're talking about. I know it's like a microbiology specific term. But I also want to point out that manure management is a good chunk of this methane emissions here. And manure comes from animals' gastrointestinal tracts. And so manure management is a little bit connected to the enteric fermentation here. So these little methanogens live inside of cows, but also other ruminants, especially like sheep and goats, inside of their GI tracts and produce a lot of methane. And normally it gets emitted as burps. Maybe you've seen this before. So that enteric fermentation in the United States is coming from animals that are producing methane from these methanogens. In the United States, we have 95 million cattle. So one of the things we could do, again, on a personal level, is decrease our beef and dairy consumption. We could do that. And we could also implement better agricultural practices that could decrease the amount of methane coming from these methanogens. Now, one more thing that I wanted to connect to microorganisms. This has been in the news quite recently. Back to, I mentioned before that actually most of the methane is produced in wetlands. And what's happening right now is that we're getting more wetlands, kind of. So permafrost, that normally is the soil that is permanently frozen, and anything in that soil is frozen, in northern regions especially, is starting to melt. And also lakes that have been previously frozen over are starting to thaw or melt. And that's actually increasing methane production, and it's causing what we call a positive feedback loop. And if I could just, positive feedback loops lead to greater changes. You may have heard of negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loops are about keeping things the same, about control, about not letting things change too much. Most living things have a lot of negative feedback mechanisms. So we try to, regulate, you and I try to regulate our body temperature, but your thermostat does that at your house. That's a great example of negative feedback. So you set your thermostat to 72 degrees. If it drops a little bit, the heat kicks on until it gets back to 72 degrees, and then the heat shuts off. So it's a way to maintain 72 degrees in this case. But in a positive feedback loop, the thing that you produce ends up causing more of that thing to be produced. And so what's happening here is that global temperatures increasing are melting permafrost, thawing lakes. And there was a whole bunch of dead organic matter, like plants and animals, that were in that permafrost, and they were frozen. And at those temperatures, they weren't being decomposed. They weren't being biodegraded. But now they're starting to biodegrade. And in melting permafrost and lakes, those are environments that are without oxygen. So microbes now have a chance to decompose those dead animals and plants, and they produce more methane and also more carbon dioxide. And so then they're producing more methane and carbon dioxide, which then heats our atmosphere more. And so then more permafrost and more lakes melt. And then more microbial decomposition leads to more greenhouse gases. So this is an example of a positive feedback loop. And these are, these are happening right now. Okay, I'm getting to near the end of my talk, and we have to think about how are we going to make changes in some of our, attitudes toward the environment, or in our policies, in the way that we behave. Part of this is about, I would say, us as Christians, like really, really grabbing onto this idea that the earth is the Lord's, that He is the owner, and we need to ask ourselves, what does that mean for our lifestyles, maybe? So that's maybe on a personal level, but if we think about it on the group level, we can think about using political interventions or solutions. I mentioned a few in California that are examples. Things like consumer activism, where you say, hey, I don't know, Starbucks, I'm not going to buy your coffee until you get fully compostable cups, or whatever. You can have groups of people who really pressure companies to their policies. Then there's, of course, education, schools and universities. That's what we're here for today. We're doing this, right? We're talking as a group about these problems and hopefully thinking about solutions. But I think maybe first we need to really understand some of the problems. And then finally, what is the role for the church in this? And one of my colleagues sent me this headline, sent me a link to an article 2 years ago. This was coming from the Church of England. As a group, they decided for Lent that they would try to decrease their plastic usage. So they put out a calendar and it had ideas every day of like, today try to do this, today try to do this. And they did that as a group. Al Gore, who started, well, if you've seen the Inconvenient Truth 1 or 2, he also heads a Climate Reality Project. He is recognizing that he really thinks people of faith are the answer to addressing climate change. There's something about our faith, again, if we believe that the earth is the Lord's, there's value to it. After every point of creation, God says it's good. Al Gore believes, and probably other people too, that Christians and other people of faith may have even more reason to take care of this creation. In 2012, a convention of the World Evangelical Alliance and the Lausanne movement met in Jamaica and wrote up what they called the Jamaica Call to Action, and it really asserts two convictions. One is that the care of creation is a gospel issue within Christ's lordship, and we might have other speakers in this series that will talk a little bit more about that, connecting the care of creation to the gospel. And the second assertion is that environmental crises are present, urgent, and must be resolved in our generation. We have a movement within the Black church in America called Green the Church, and they are talking about issues of environmental justice and racial justice. These things have points of connection. I just looked at their website yesterday, and they are encouraging members to take the pledge, and the beginning of the pledge says, I pledge to vote with climate and creation in mind. And it's a longer pledge, but they're also saying as a church, we need to use our political power to also think, at least keep climate and creation in mind when voting. Last year, other bishops of the Church of England made headlines because they joined Extinction Rebellion protesters and they're activists that do some disruption in especially in the UK. They're really active in the UK, and so that kind of made headline news. And then last year also, California Catholic bishops were calling for an ecological conversion. Now, ecological conversion is a term that Pope Francis used in his encyclical, in his letter called Laudato Si, or On Care for Our Common Home. And if you haven't read that, I really, really recommend that you read it. What does ecological conversion mean? I'm going to read a little excerpt here from Laudato Si that I think maybe embodies that. Quoting Patriarch Bartholomew, who's part of the Orthodox Church, Pope Francis writes, Patriarch Bartholomew asks us to replace consumption with sacrifice, greed with generosity, wastefulness with a spirit of sharing, and asceticism which entails learning to give and not simply to give up. It is a way of loving or moving gradually away from what I want to what God's world needs. It is liberation from fear, greed, and compulsion. And I think this kind of sums up his idea of ecological conversion. So I think we're on a path. I hope we're on a path of that at APU. But we have some other resources. APU has a sustainability club if you're a student and you're interested in joining. And we also, they've partnered with the Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. And so actually APU Sustainability Club is connected to other sustainability clubs now on other campuses in a way that the club wasn't last year. So this is a new development. And then finally, we this year have an environmental studies minor, and you can get some more information. You can contact Rich Slimbach. You can contact Rich Slimbach in Global Studies. You can contact me if you want some more information on that. So I would like to at least give you a little bit of time to ask your questions. I didn't give you much time. But I don't know, Jennifer, if you want to mediate some of those.
Yes, I'm going to go ahead and mediate, and I'll go starting from the beginning. So the first question is, are there more efficient solutions to packaging than the use of plastic? It's a two-parter. And the second part, are there any specific companies you can think of that use less package so we can buy more ecologically friendly items?
Yeah, okay. So the first question is, are there more, was it sustainable packaging methods? Was that or more
efficient solutions?
Efficient?
Yes.
Probably. It's interesting because I know my cousin got a degree at Michigan State in like packaging or something like that. So that's actually a subspecialty that I don't know too much about, but I do know that people are trying to use different materials, plastics in packaging. So even things like, as a styrofoam is one of the worst, or polystyrene is one of the worst. It's one of the hardest to recycle, and it gets everywhere. It's like light and the wind blows it. There are people, I think this is cool too. This is a microbial solution. There's a company that uses fungus because fungus can form, certain fungi can form materials that are kind of plastic-like. And I know that is, they've been doing more business over the last few years. In the very beginning, I think they're called Mycelium. I think that's the name of the company. Other companies that use less packaging. Well, I do know that, for instance, if you buy stuff on Amazon, you can call them and tell them you want, hey, I don't want any plastic in packaging. That's something I don't usually order from Amazon, but I do buy things secondhand sometimes, like clothes secondhand online, and I will contact the people ahead of time, just be like, what are you going to use for packaging? And if they say plastic or they won't be willing to use something else, then I'll just be like, no, that's okay. But if they say, oh, I'm just going to reuse, an old envelope, then I'm like, yeah. So, I mean, some of it has to be, at this point, you probably need to do some research on your own. I also get a CSA, one of those farm boxes, and I've been bugging them. I bugged them for, I don't know, a couple of years, and they finally just, because they would sometimes send me plastic bags and things, and I just said, I don't want them. I don't want the plastic. And now they give me everything plastic free. So I get this box of produce, and it's just like all in a box, all mixed together, and I don't care because I don't want all that plastic. Yeah. I don't know if that helps. There are probably a million other ideas. I think Pinterest has a lot of things on packaging and packaging alternatives.
Oh, that's a good idea. Well, that helps answer the second question, which is, what are good alternatives of plastic that are just as durable but don't deplete or damage the environment?
I'm not sure that, I don't know that we could say that things are as durable, but I guess one question is like, but how durable do things actually have to be? Is it overkill? Is our durability overkill? In some cases, it might not be. In some cases, plastic might be the best choice and we go with it. But I suspect that, like we didn't really need bananas wrapped in plastic because they already have a skin.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, some of it is just like, there's no need for that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, these are like case by case basis questions or answers, I guess.
So the next question is, there have been many smaller companies that have made these changes or gone towards this. How do we work with larger companies to be more eco-friendly? And you already mentioned it with Amazon, but any other examples?
Well, was it last year? A bunch of, when Starbucks had their shareholders meeting, I think it was last year, there was a ton of activism. And it wasn't necessarily from the shareholders, but people who were saying, look, you have promised to make your cups sustainable. Those paper cups are lined in plastic. They're not compostable. And then there's plastic too, the lids. And they have have said they would be more ecologically, more sustainable, and haven't done it. And so basically people were taking them to task. Now, what have been the results of that? I don't know. I don't really go to Starbucks much, so I don't really know. But I do think that, if I'm remembering correctly, they started having a plastic cup that was reusable. But it was like a lighter weight one that you would use like 10 times or something.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So there's some kinds of organized activism. There's also, you know, you can write letters yourself as well. It's probably more powerful if you can get a group to do it. But there's no reason you can't just email a company and be like, hey, I was going to buy your product, but there was too much packaging.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I decided not to.
All right. Well, the next question has to do with shopping during the pandemic, and some stores are still not allowing you to bring your own bags.
Yep.
So the question is, do the market bags nowadays have a type of plastic that is less dangerous for the environment?
That's a good question. I did notice that they're different. They're not that light. They're number 4 plastic usually. The low density polyethylene is what normal single-use garbage or plastic bags are made of. I don't know, but I've noticed that there are some plastic bags now in some stores that are a different plastic. I've looked for a number and I haven't seen one, so I'm not sure what it is. The number 4 are hard to recycle, the single-use old plastic bags. I don't know about this one. That's a good point. And even if it is technically recyclable, again, I live in Los Angeles, do they have a market for those to be recycled? Does Azusa have a market? You know, Azusa's waste company, do they have a market for them? And that's another question. You can do some it takes quite a while to really get to the bottom of some of these questions. They're worth asking though, and worth putting out there. I mean, now you just gave me an idea that if I go to the store next time, they try to give me a plastic bag. Although now I've been trying not to shop anywhere that I know they give out plastic. But I could ask them, what kind of plastic is this?
Yeah.
Where do you think it's going to go afterwards?
Mm-hmm. Okay, the next question has to do with what you spoke about on the digestion of the animals, specifically the birds. So for animals consuming plastic that end up dying, if we had the same issue with other pollutants like paper or glass, is that more digestible for the animals?
Glass, no, but I don't think glass would float if it got into the ocean, right? I don't think it would float. And then probably, I don't know, you've seen sea glass, right? I guess wave action would probably get rid of it at some point. Part of the thing is that plastics float, they're buoyant, for at least for a while. So it's a little bit easier for, you know, animals most of the animals live kind of in the top layer, most of the ocean. Paper, I don't see, they wouldn't probably digest paper, but it would probably go through them. But it would depend. It would probably depend on the size. It would depend. I don't think that microorganisms would attach to paper the same way. And I would wonder about like whether it would be buoyant too. So those are good questions. I hadn't even considered those before.
Thank you. Next question is somewhat related.
Wait, can I back up though? But paper is biodegradable, so it will go away. There are microorganisms that can eat it.
All right. So if we were to switch to glass or paper, what would that be better overall, or would it just cause another issue with a shortage of sand and destruction of trees?
Yeah, and not to mention then that things that are shipped in glass are heavier, so they're going to take more fuel. So now we're going to get to the part where then we have to say, if we plan to consume at the levels we are currently consuming, there are going to be problems with any materials, right? If we go back to what the Pope is saying, an ecological conversion is, I'm going to live with less. I'm going to try to make do with less. Where are the things that I don't need? What are my real needs? What are the things that I want? And that might help too, because I would say overall, all things we should be decreasing our consumption of, because just like you pointed out, glass comes from sand. Like it comes from somewhere. And if we just keep making more glass, then we're going to have deficiencies elsewhere. I think this is really where, I don't know how we do it I don't know how we do it at APU. I don't know how we do it as a nation, because it's countercultural to just say, look, I'm going to live a very simple lifestyle because that is what is best for everyone and everything on the earth.
So part of that, another question is silicone any better?
Silicone is really still a type of plastic, so it's not going to break down. It won't break down naturally, it won't biodegrade. But it may, depending on what you use it for, it can, it's very durable. So I'm thinking of those like period cups that I know some people use. Probably you buy one and then you use it for 30 years, 40 years. That's probably much better than the alternatives, all the other products.
Okay, so 2 more questions. It seems like the biggest change happens at the government corporation level. Is there a way that we individually can influence politicians and bigger companies to help pass these bills and make these big changes?
I mean, I think we group together. You find the people that care about these things, you get together. You come to the APU Sustainability Club, you come to Creation Care Council, and we talk about these things. How as a group can we affect change? My church, your church, my church, we can write as a group. My church does this sometimes. We do sometimes write letters to politicians who are our representatives and say, we as a church, we did say something about the straws, actually. And that was a little bit contentious, actually, at the church, because there were some people who did not agree with that. But those are avenues. I think it's hard as an individual, but I mean, the way that I look at it is you leverage all the groups that you have. You have some individual power. You can write your own letters, especially if you get outraged enough. You have family members, friends, classmates, church friends, and then those and other family members. Those are groups that you can use to make changes too. I don't know. I don't have a good, perfect answer, except that just as you pointed out, it is a group effort. It's going to take a group effort. But then I think about APU and I think like, well, we have a group right here. We have a community right here. And we can have these discussions. And you're here today. So that's maybe where some of my hope comes from.
I also wanted to point out that find out who your local legislation is. So some people might be wondering, who am I writing to? That's who you would be writing to.
So I'll just tell you that bill that I mentioned, the plastic bill that was really comprehensive, I wrote to my California rep a lot about that because I really wanted that to pass. So that's my own personal belief, but Miguel Santiago is my California Assembly rep, and so I write him all the time. I get letters from him a lot too, by the way.
So how did you find your rep? Some people might want to know.
I think you can go to a website. It's pretty easy if you just did a search. It's like, who is my California Assembly person, or who is my California Assembly senator? You should have one senator and one rep. Actually, if you live in Azusa, I know who your representative is. It's Blanca Rubio. She went to APU actually.
Oh, okay.
And she's come and visited us a few times. She's your California Assembly rep. Is that right? No, yeah, I think she's a California legislature. Your US one is Judy too. But yeah, you can look it up online.
Okay.
And then through their website, you can usually call them, email them, you can show up to their office. Most of them have offices in LA, so you could make an appointment. You'll probably just talk to an intern, but you'll talk to somebody face to face. That's kind of fun too.
All right, I have one final question. Is it possible to reproduce and utilize microorganisms that break down plastic in controlled environments rather than releasing them into the environment as you suggested being potentially dangerous?
That's possible, and that would make more sense on kind of like if you're working in a landfill, right? Because you have it all in one place. That's a possibility. It becomes a challenge though, just because again, we have to think about there are a lot of different kinds of plastics that would be in a landfill and they're not necessarily sorted. If you had a system for sorting things before they went into a landfill or, you know, things like that, I could think of some potential systems. The challenge is those plastics that you can't easily get to, trying to figure out a way to break them down. I just don't, I don't have a good answer for that.
Okay. Well, this is the end of the questions, so this will be the end of the lecture. Is there any lasting point that you want to make?
The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. It does belong to the Lord.
Thank you very
that's what I'll end
much.
on. Oh yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for coming, everybody.
All right, thank
I
you.
appreciate your questions.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hit the stop record button and we'll hang out for a couple more minutes if you wanted to
Sure.
have another question, but I'm going to go ahead and hit stop.
Just
Thank
say
you
hi.
so much, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
And I hope that you can come to our future lectures.